Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show. And tonight we are going to be talking about the question, whose side are you on? So what's the latest news from the Black Intifada Day 4? This from just an hour and a half ago. From the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, curfews ordered for Minneapolis-St. Paul starting 8 p.m. Friday. Both mayors are imposing a blanket curfew from 8 p.m. till 6 a.m. Saturday, and then again at 8 p.m. Saturday, expiring 6 a.m. Sunday. According to Mayor Jacob Fry, and we'll have lots more to say about him in just a minute, during the curfew, all persons must not travel on any public street or in any public place. St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter declared a state of local emergency Friday and announced the curfew, as well as inviting everyone to observe an hour of prayer from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. It's kind of interesting, the sort of things that inspire prayer, particularly public prayer these days. The curfews do not extend to people traveling to or from work, emergency services, law enforcement, people seeking emergency medical care or fleeing danger, the homeless, and the news media, according to a parallel order from Governor Tim Walz. All Minnesotans in Minneapolis and St. Paul are urged to voluntarily comply. Peace officers will enforce the curfew and arrest those who refuse to comply. Violations of the curfew are a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 90 days in jail or a $1,000 fine. So I guess this will be interpreted as the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul saying that the rolling observance of the death of George Floyd is not to be observed over the weekend, at least at night. So, more breaking news today, and this is from the Daily Mail, as Alan Partridge said, arguably the greatest newspaper in the world. And why is that? Well, because it's chock full of information that American newspapers simply won't print. The information is out there, but so much of it is, how shall we say, problematic. Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is charged with murder in George Floyd's death. As criminal complaint reveals, he kept kneeling on the black man's neck for almost 3 minutes after he fell unconscious. Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman announced Chauvin was taken into custody by state investigators on Friday afternoon and was charged with first-degree murder. Other stories I saw said third-degree murder. Okay. I guess this story was written very quickly, so it says both first-degree murder and third-degree murder. The charges come a day after prosecutors had warned there was evidence that did not support criminal charges in the case, saying they needed to prove Chauvin had used excessive force on Floyd. A criminal complaint on Friday shed light on the moments leading up to Floyd's death, revealing he was non-responsive for almost 3 minutes before Chauvin released him from under his knee. The defendant had his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in total. 2 minutes and 53 seconds of this was after Floyd was non-responsive. It knows police officers are trained that this amount of time of restraint on a suspect in that position is inherently dangerous. However, a preliminary autopsy did not find evidence of, quote, traumatic asphyxia or strangulation, unquote, and found Floyd may have died from being restrained as well as from underlying health conditions. I'm looking at these pictures from the Daily Mail, and the Daily Mail publishes a lot of pictures, very large pictures. And the Antifa crowd is out there in force, including a woman wearing a mask. And of course, she's dressed all in black because that's how you dress in late May in Minneapolis when the temperature is sweltering. But I've noticed this increasingly with young women on the street, that the idea that it's summer, you can wear lighter clothes, you can wear white. White after Memorial Day was the rule. No. I guess they think that they lose a street cred if they do so. And so, talk here about the extraordinary speed in charging the case just 4 days after Floyd died. But the prosecutor defended himself against questions about why it did not happen sooner. As for the other 3 officers who were fired alongside Chauvin over Floyd's death, J. Alexander Kung, Thomas Lane, and Tu Thao, Freeman said the investigation is ongoing and prosecutors chose to focus on the most dangerous perpetrator. The charges come after 3 days of riots and protests that erupted across Minneapolis and several states demanding justice for 46-year-old Floyd. Floyd family attorney Ben Crump, you might remember that name because he was also the family attorney for St. Trayvon Martin, and he makes a specialty of this. Of course, Jesse Jackson, still alive, went to Minneapolis, and the Reverend Al Sharpton as well. Can't let a crisis go to waste. U.S. Attorney General William Barr, meanwhile, said he is confident justice will be served, calling the videos of Floyd's death harrowing to watch and deeply disturbing. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz on Friday acknowledged the abject failure of the response to this week's violent protests, which left Minneapolis in ruins after hundreds of businesses were looted and destroyed, and the 3rd Police Precinct was burned to the ground. And as it was burning to the ground, fireworks were let off. A very festive scene. It turns out that this is very much an intersectional crime, because I'm looking at one of the officers at the scene of Floyd's death, Tu Thao. He's an Asian man. And it turns out that police officer Chauvin is married to an Asian woman. How about that? So we have learned quite a bit about the circumstances leading up to George Floyd's arrest and death, and also about the history of this man, who we were told he was getting his life together. That's the cliche, isn't it? I mean, had some difficulties, but he was getting his life together. He was not dropping a mixtape on SoundCloud, as far as I know. That is usually part of this narrative. Again, from the Mail, your one-stop shop for all Minnesota disaster news. Police released 911 call to arrest George Floyd, which claims he was awfully drunk and not in control of himself when he tried to pay with a counterfeit $20 bill. This was at a Cup Foods store. So, according to the owner, Mike Abumayala, so even more intersectional here, Floyd had tried to use a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes, but was turned away by an employee. He is said to have come back a second time using the fake bill, according to NBC News. The caller said staff only realized the money could be fake once he left the Cup Food store in Minneapolis. Someone followed him out and demanded he turn in his phone and the cigarettes before he was allowed to leave. However, he refused. The store owner said what took place outside after that was not in our hands. The murder and execution was something done by the police, and the abuse of power, the police brutality, needs to stop. In the call, the employee can be heard explaining to authorities that the suspect ran off once paying with the fake bill. If you'd managed to pass a counterfeit $20 bill, why would you run off immediately, drawing suspicion to yourself? And there is the release of the 911 transcript. He had his vehicle, which was a blue van. And he's tall and bald, about like 6'6", 1.5", and he's not acting right. So she started to go drive the car. And okay, so we know the crime for which he eventually died. I just want to make it clear that obviously using forged money is not worth a death sentence. No question about that. This crime very much reminds me of that of Eric Garner in New York City, who was selling singles, not to say single cigarettes, on the streets of New York, and he ended up dead. This is just a bad business all around. These are not particularly serious crimes. However, George Floyd did resist arrest twice and was grappling with the officers. I will get to the manner of his restraint in just a minute. Oh, this story just gets weirder and weirder and weirder. The chairperson of the Minneapolis City Council, and who I'll have more information about that person a little later, claimed that George Floyd and the police officer who was directly responsible for his death, Derek Chauvin, they worked together at the same Minneapolis club for something like, they worked concurrently for a number of months. A former club owner in Minneapolis says that both George Floyd and the police officer seen kneeling on his neck moments before he died in custody on Monday both worked security at his business until the end of last year. And this was the El Nuevo Rodeo Club. Chauvin was our off-duty police for almost the entirety of the 17 years that we were open, says Maya Santa Maria, and again, more intersectionality. Santa Maria said that she is not sure if the two men knew each other, since there were some 24 security guards, including off-duty officers, working at her club on any given night. But she revealed that there were occasions when they would have been working at the same event. According to Santa Maria, Chauvin had a tendency to flash his temper and overreact to situations. He sometimes had a real short fuse, and he seemed afraid, she said. When there was an altercation, he always resorted to pulling out his mace and pepper spraying everybody right away, even if I felt it was unwarranted, which raises the obvious question, why didn't she fire him from this job? Santa Maria wondered if Monday's incident could have turned out differently if Chauvin recognized Floyd from their days working at her club. What if he could have just said, hey man, you and I worked together at Maya's place, remember me? Floyd moved to Minneapolis from Houston sometime around 2014, according to the Chicago Tribune. He had also worked as a bouncer for a nearby restaurant, the Conga Latin Bistro. Neither Chauvin's attorney or the Minneapolis Police Department could be reached for comment. Well, it's my understanding that it's very common for police officers to work as security at various places in order to bring in more income. So, on to more information about this fellow. Again, from the indispensable mail, a new start turns to a tragic end for George Floyd. This fellow Floyd had, as the cliche goes, an arrest record as long as your arm. And the Mail has a list of them. But it tells us that the 46-year-old moved to the city in 2014 and worked as a bouncer at a local restaurant, leaving behind his past in the Houston area. Floyd had made changes to his lifestyle, and a recent video has emerged of him pleading with younger generations to make good choices and to stop gun violence. Well, I'm sure he was perfectly sincere about this. And again, I don't think that the nature of his crime in any way justifies his death. But he was obviously out of his mind on alcohol or drugs or both, and somehow got possession of a counterfeit $20 bill, which he passed off at a convenience store. Floyd had been sentenced for 5 years in prison in 2009 for aggravated assault stemming from a robbery, a home invasion, actually, where Floyd entered a woman's home, pointed a gun at her stomach, and searched the home for drugs and money. There were no drugs and money there. So let's see. We have aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. We have possession with intent to distribute. We have, let me just count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 convictions. And there are two earlier cases in which the disposition is not known. Let's get more details here. The final straw for Floyd came after serving 5 years in prison in 2009. Well, that should be from 2009 for aggravated assault from a robbery in 2007. Yes, home invasion, searched the home for drugs and money. He pleaded guilty to the robbery, where another suspect posed as a worker for the local water department wearing a blue uniform in an attempt to gain access to the woman's home. But when the woman opened the door, she realized he was not with the water department and attempted to close the door, leading to a struggle. At that time, a Ford Explorer pulled up to the home and 5 other males exited the car and went up to the front door. The report states the largest of the group, who the victim later identified as Floyd, forced his way inside the residence, placed a pistol against the complainant's abdomen, and forced her into the living room area of the residence. This large suspect then proceeded to search the residence while another armed suspect guarded the complainant, who was struck in the head and sides by the second armed suspect with his pistol while she screamed for help. Not finding any drugs or money at the house, the men took jewelry and the woman's cell phone and fled in their car. A neighbor who witnessed the robbery took down the car's license plate number. Later, police tracked down the car and found Floyd behind the wheel. He was later identified by the woman as a large suspect. Yes, a very stupid crime, I must say. So we have a bunch of drug convictions. We have convictions for theft. We have convictions for threats, exhibiting a deadly, aggravated robbery with a firearm. Yes, first-degree felony. Let's see, sentenced to 10 months in state jail for possession of cocaine, which was updated to intent to deliver a controlled substance. 2 other cocaine offenses, criminal trespassing, 30 days in jail, theft with a firearm in August 1988, 10 months served. 2 convictions in the 90s for theft and delivery of a controlled substance, but it's not clear if Floyd served any time for either of those offenses. The Mail editorializes, despite his checkered past, it seems that Floyd has turned his life around for his death on Monday. Well, clearly he had not. Clearly he had not. Now, we saw that the narrative in the Trayvon Martin case collapsed, and the narrative in the Michael Brown Gentle Giant case collapsed. But you see the argument that's going to be made is going to be made already. That George Floyd had a lengthy criminal record, including some very serious crimes of violence, but whose fault is that? Is that his fault? No, clearly it is society's fault. It is the fault of white people, racist white people, who have racialized and brutalized through a systemically racist justice system all Black people and people of color in America and in Canada too. I'll be getting to that. There may be some fireworks in Toronto tomorrow. Again, yes, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey said on Thursday he considers Floyd's death to be a murder. It's a grossly irresponsible thing for the mayor to have said, and it's arguable that he bears a large degree of responsibility for the riots that took place, because he seemed to be justifying them. But more on that in a minute. There's a lengthy story from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Police experts condemn knee restraint used on George Floyd. Now, it's been pointed out to me that, of course, the person's breathing passage is on the front of the neck, not on the back of the neck, which again, the preliminary autopsy did not, it ruled out asphyxia. And so there must have been some other reason why he died. But clearly he was in distress for almost 3 minutes before his death. Police around the nation and law enforcement experts on Thursday broadly condemned the way George Floyd was restrained by an officer who dug his knee into the man's neck, saying no circumstances warrant such a dangerous technique. Any officer who abuses their power or stands by and allows it to happen does not deserve to wear the badge, period. Yeah, we saw that in St. Paul. The police in St. Paul got very smug about this death because, we're better than that here. That did not stop St. Paul from going up in flames. Floyd wasn't actively resisting, and he was saying he couldn't breathe, said Charles Stevenson, a former police officer and FBI agent with expertise in use of force tactics. You have to understand that possibility is there, that Floyd couldn't breathe, and you release any kind of restriction you might have in an airway immediately. Actually, this wasn't a restriction on his airway. Police recruits learn a variety of use of force techniques at the academy, all with the idea that any force employed may equal but not exceed the physical resistance offered by a suspect. Of course, that's very much a judgment call. One technique is to restrain someone on the ground face down, but officers are taught to press a part of the lower leg, such as the shin or top of the ankle, across the shoulders or the back. In some cases, officers will hog-tie suspects' legs to prevent flight or violent resistance. But no police academy that we know of teaches a police officer to use their knee to put it on their neck, said Chuck Wexler, executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum, which researches and advises on police practices. They're just not taught that because that can impact their breathing and their carotid artery, a crucial vessel that supplies blood to the brain. So when police look at that video, they are shocked that those tactics were used. What's more, officers are taught to get a suspect up from the ground as soon as possible, either sitting or standing, since lying on one's stomach can cause breathing problems, especially for larger people. If what we saw was a continuing, ongoing fight, I could see how a leg, for example, could slip to the back of the neck, but that's not what I'm seeing, said John Bostain, a former officer and president of Command Presence, which trains police around the country. I'm seeing a fight that appears to be over. Floyd's case and the recent shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia have once again laid bare the divide between minority communities and law enforcement that grew to a nationwide uproar following the officer killings of Eric Garner and Michael Brown in 2014 and the death of Freddie Gray in police custody in 2015, among others. Nationwide uproar is a kind of a interesting way to describe two cities being laid waste to, sacked. But you see the reluctance to use this word, rioters. The word protesters is used instead. But of course, there's no question that these were rioters. And we have rioters all over the country. I guess the lockdown in Minnesota, which was one of the strictest in the United States, can be considered to be over now. Good cops are dead cops. And I'm looking at this as graffiti, this graffito, very, very large indeed. The National Guard has been deployed to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and very intimidating they look indeed. One wouldn't want to go against them. And I'm looking at a picture of the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey. Many people have noted the resemblance to our own beloved Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Of course, as I mentioned yesterday, he doesn't seem to have been able to get a haircut for quite a few weeks, but apparently he was unable to get a razor because he's now up to about 4 or 5 days of not shaving. Perhaps he's going to grow a beard, as Justin Trudeau did in an attempt to rehabilitate his image. Someone asked, put on Twitter a picture of him posing next to some woman, and he was wearing some sort of bracelet on his arms, some sort of Spider-Man thing or whatever. What does this look like? I suggested the proprietor of a carbon neutral bike shop. I suppose others had more amusing responses. The National Guard defended its response, saying it could act only once it had been given a mission, but the mission never came. Yeah, it's all very well and good to call it the National Guard, but if you don't tell them what to do, especially these days, they're not going to do anything. We've all seen the video of various types of police simply doing nothing as large parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul were sacked. But cover your ass. That is the governing principle here. Governor Walz says it was down to city mayors to coordinate the response and that they simply never asked for his help, but that on Friday and going forward, there would be no such vacuum of leadership. You will not see that tonight. There will be no lack of leadership. Major General John Jensen of the Minnesota National Guard on Friday said there was a lack of clear direction, that he was, quote, very concerned about being asked to move to an unfamiliar area of Minneapolis under the cover of darkness, unquote. He added, what traditionally comes with the request is the layout of capability needed and the exact problem that they're trying to solve. Typically, the request for the Guard and that type of information come at the same time. Sometimes it lags. And we'll get to what President Trump had to say about this. But the Governor Walz said that he spoke to Trump before he tweeted, I did speak to the president at that point in time. It was in the process where I said we were going to assume control of this and that it was unnecessary. Actually, what Trump said was quite ambiguous, deliberately so, I think. Oh, a couple of journalists were arrested, and that's the big story here, I guess. Governor Walz said the protection on security and safety of the journalists covering this is a top priority, not because it's a nice thing to do, because it is a key component of how we fix this. Yeah, cities are being burned to the ground, but we can't have journalists inconvenienced. A total of 500 National Guard soldiers were deployed to the streets of Minneapolis and neighboring St. Paul last night. And Mayor Fry was forced to declare a state of emergency as rioting continued into the early hours. Just bear with me here. I've got a little problem with my trackball. Okay. So yeah, we've got the state of emergency, and let's get to the mayor here, Mayor Fry. He has been very emotional since this began. Very emotional indeed. And he is not at all happy with the President of the United States. Donald Trump last night threatened to assume control of Minneapolis, warning thugs in the city. Oh, dear. I mean, this word thugs, it's a racist word, right? I mean, it's always racist, I guess. You just can't use that word, thugs. In the city, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, he tweeted after demonstrators set fire to a police precinct and protests erupted across the states. Trump used Twitter to intervene in the carnage, which erupted for a third consecutive night following the death of George Floyd. The president's incendiary tweet is now hidden by a warning that it violated Twitter's rules about glorifying violence, but the message can be bypassed and the tweet remains live. It cannot be responded to, however. The official White House Twitter account sent the same message out, and it was censored in the same way. Cops were forced to flee from the burning Minneapolis 3rd Police Precinct late Thursday when rioters broke in and set fire to the building, roaming through its corridors with baseball bats, axes, and torches. Shocking footage showed flames billowing out of the police station just hours after prosecutors warned there is evidence that does not support criminal charges in the case of the 4 cops accused of killing Floyd, sparking fears that they will continue to walk free. This gives a suggestion that what the authorities should have said, of course, all these officers will be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. Please don't let your protesting, your noble protesting, get out of hand. Because apparently it's completely justified. And the rule that was established in Baltimore, in Ferguson, in 2016, is that the protesters, aka rioters, should be given, let's say, 3 days just to burn down as much of the city and loot as much of the city as they can in order to, as a proper memorial to the dead man. There is a lot of, from these excellent pictures from the Daily Mail, there are a lot of people on the streets explicitly calling on policemen to be killed. Save a life, kill a cop is one sign. Watching that video, really extraordinary, with the fireworks. I mean, was there a fireworks store across the street? Did they bring fireworks with them in anticipation of sacking the police station? It's really remarkable. Mayor Fry called the looting unacceptable. That's the sort of thing an authority figure says when he's not going to do anything about it. But he raged at Trump for, quote, refusing to take responsibility for your own actions, whatever that might mean, saying the president knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. Are we going to see all these morons with signs and T-shirts saying Minneapolis strong, St. Paul strong? Trump's first tweet in the chain accused the radical left mayor of showing a total lack of leadership and warned he was poised to send in troops. This tweet was not hidden by Twitter. So Twitter gets to decide what the president of the United States can see now. In New York City, NYPD officers were seen brawling on the ground with protesters as at least 70 people were arrested in the Big Apple. Protesters in Ohio smashed the windows of the State House in downtown Columbus. I'll get more on that later. And demonstrators damaged a police cruiser in downtown Los Angeles. Over in Kentucky, 7 people were shot in downtown Louisville during a protest demanding justice for Black woman Breonna Taylor, who was shot dead by cops back in March, as the Floyd case reignited tensions between cops and the African-American community. Trump said, I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis, a total lack of leadership. Either the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Fry, gets his act together and brings the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job right. These thugs, thugs is in all caps, are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Any difficulty, and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts. I'm looking at a picture outside of a liquor store, a burning liquor store, and I would say that there are several thousand people on the streets in front of it. They all seem to be having a good time. But the mayor seems totally overwhelmed by everything that has happened. And he simply, hang on, I just want to, this is from The Hill. This is a pretty good summary. He reminds me of Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, after the Christchurch shooting, where, of course, she was wearing Muslim headgear. She looked as if she were about to burst into tears, and so does this weak man. Weakness is pointing your finger at somebody else during a time of crisis. Donald Trump knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. I suppose if it were pointed out to Jacob Fry that it is his responsibility to maintain order in his city, he would accuse his critics of insensitivity. Fry also called for peace in the city during an emotional Thursday press conference, saying that the outbreak of protests in Minneapolis is the result of so much built-up anger and sadness. If you're feeling that sadness, that anger, it is not only understandable, it's right. It's a reflection of the truth that our Black community has lived. While not from lived experience, that sadness must also be understood by our non-Black communities. To ignore it, to toss it out, would be to ignore the values that we all claim to have that are all the more important during a time of crisis. Yes, the sacking of Minneapolis has reaffirmed the values of Minneapolis. That's a pretty good one, wouldn't you say? And Fry made reference to 400 years. And of course, this is the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which was awarded a Pulitzer Prize, despite the fact that it is chock full of inanities. And let's talk about anarcho-tyranny. A man was shot and killed Wednesday night as protests broke out near East Lake Street and Bloomington Avenue. The owner of a nearby business is under arrest. Hector Hernandez captured the unrest as it unfolded in front of his restaurant. I start to see like thousands of people running around. Next thing you know, we probably have 100 people banging on the windows, throwing rocks, Hernandez said. Somewhere in the chaos, shots rang out. Abby Bears and her employees heard the unmistakable sound. That was like what was happening. All of a sudden, a man is running over here and he just collapsed right there in the corner. We're told a business owner on East Lake Street had opened fire. It went out of control, so I can understand his fear and his pain, knowing he's about to lose everything that he's worked for so many years. This is not how it should have been, Bears said. Yes. So a businessman shoots a member of a mob who's attempting to sack his business, and he is the one who gets arrested. Because that's how they roll in Minneapolis. I suppose you could say that it's a value. It's a Minneapolis of value. Let's see. Here's the quote. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry said the reaction to the death of George Floyd is a result of built up, quote, anger and sadness that has been ingrained in our Black community, not just because of 5 minutes of horror, but 400 years, unquote. Of course, Minneapolis hasn't been around for 400 years, and I shouldn't think there were very many Black people in Minneapolis until, I don't know, after the Second World War, the 1960s. Minneapolis has a very generous welfare program, which has served to attract people of color from Chicago and other cities. And of course, Minneapolis is the home of many Somalis who have done so much to enrich Minneapolis in recent years. Here's more from Jacob Fry. Brick and mortar is not as important as life. I suppose that depends. It's a question of proportion. Because if brick and mortar is not as important as human life, is the principle here that it would be wrong to kill one person to stop the sacking of a city? Because this seems to be what Fry is suggesting. Quote, the symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life, of our officers, of the public. Some buildings have symbolism, but buildings are physical objects, and often they contain businesses. Often they contain people. But, yes, property is as nothing compared to people. Well, one of the things that characterizes people is their ownership of property. We would not risk serious injury to anyone, and we will continue to patrol the 3rd precinct, where the station house was burned down. We will continue to do our jobs in that area, but you haven't been doing your jobs. Brick and mortar is not as important as life. Happy to answer any questions on this topic. The resources that we will offer to the people of the 3rd precinct will continue, period. Ooh, tough guy. The building is just bricks and mortar. It's a building. Yeah, it's a building that contained people. People who had to flee in terror for their lives. And, of course, the 3rd precinct, it's going to be rather difficult to police that now, but perhaps that's a new Minneapolis value that certain parts of the city simply won't be policed. Of course, Steve Saylor has written about the Ferguson effect and the dramatic rise in murders. following the riots in Ferguson in Baltimore. And again, why would police officers in any American city become involved with Black people? I mean, for any reason whatsoever. I see Black people in whole neighborhoods being left to their own devices because it's too dangerous to do otherwise. Here's another choice quote from our oh so sensitive mayor. Donald Trump knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. We are as strong as hell. Is this a difficult time period? Yes, but you better be damn sure we're going to get through this. He sounds as if he's trying to persuade himself of this. I mean, this isn't a funny story, but it's always amusing when one sees a politician who is quite obviously not fit for purpose. Okay, so I promised you this. The city council vice president of Minneapolis is called Andrea Jenkins. Perhaps it's pronounced Andrea, I don't know. And this person, and I use that phrase advisedly, was called out to sing a spiritual, something like that. And she prefaced it by saying, oh, she's got a mask, but it's hanging on one ear. Now, we've been told, churches have been instructed that parishioners cannot sing. But this person was singing in public. Quote, I am asking my colleagues to declare a state of emergency declaring racism as a public health issue until we name this virus, this disease that has infected America for the past 400 years. We will never, ever resolve this issue, unquote. You will recall, was it yesterday? I was saying on this show, or maybe late last week, maybe Friday, that COVID-19, which has shut down, people have been stripped of their civil rights, their most basic civil rights, and free speech as well. Well, you see, that's justified because this is a public health issue. Well, I warned you all that various agitators and law professors, distinguished community organizers, and some politicians have been saying for quite some time that racism is a public health issue. And if public health outstrips all other considerations, well, then there's no more civil rights in the United States or anywhere else in the Western world. So what do we know about Andrea Jenkins, born 1961? And this woman is has cornrows, but is bald. Half of the hair is gone. I don't know. Would I get in trouble for calling it male pattern baldness? This person is described as an American policy aide, politician, writer, performance artist, poet, and transgender activist. She is known for being the first Black openly transgender woman elected to public office in the United States, serving since January 2018 on the Minneapolis City Council. Jenkins moved to Minnesota to attend the University of Minnesota in 1979 and was hired by the Hennepin County government, where she worked for a decade. Jenkins worked on a staff member on the Minneapolis City Council for 12 years before beginning work as curator of the Transgender Oral History Project. And I have to suppress an urge to do a Beavis and Butthead laugh after that phrase. At the University of Minnesota's Jean-Nicolas Tretter collection in gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender studies. Raised in Chicago, grew up in a low-income, working-class community, lived in some pretty rough places. She participated in the Cub Scouts, and she played football at Robert Lindblom Math and Science Academy before moving to Minneapolis in 1979. In her 20s, Jenkins came out as gay, married a woman. Now I'm really confused. Became a parent and divorced. At 30, she began to outwardly present as female and returned to college to finish her bachelor's degree from Metropolitan State University, which she followed by earning two master's degrees. an MFA in creative writing from Hamline University, and an MS in community economic development from Southern New Hampshire University, during which Jenkins worked as a vocational counselor for the Hennepin County government. Jenkins was one of several dozen women featured on the January 29, 2018 Time cover. The related article is about the many women who ran for office in 2017 and 2018. 5 of the women featured are lesbian and transgender candidates, all recipients of the Alphabet People Victory Fund. Jenkins is a performance artist, poet, and writer who identifies as bisexual and queer. She is a grandmother. She was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2018. Jenkins has cited Barack Obama, Harold Washington, the Black Panther Party, Jeremiah Wright, and Jesse Jackson as having influenced her to be involved with politics. Let's have a look at the chat, see what's going on there. Walrus Libertarian says, Dr. Fauci is now saying masks are symbolic. You notice that no one has been talking about COVID-19 since, Tuesday? It's remarkable, isn't it? The shortness of the internet cycle. That this was the greatest crisis that the United States had faced, in this century? Or perhaps for a century? It's like, yeah, we've moved on. Paul Rosine says, cornrows but bald, just about fell off my chair. Stevie Wonder, cornrows but bald. It's not a good look. You may have heard the longstanding rumor that Stevie Wonder has never been blind, that it was all a show business come on. And Shaquille O'Neal believes it's true because he had an encounter with him. They lived in the same building in Los Angeles, and coming up to the elevator, Stevie Wonder apparently looked at Shaq and says, "Hi, Shaq, how are you doing?" And Shaq almost fell down. Of course, Stevie Wonder has talked about driving cars. You can't drive a car if you're blind. You can't. You have no sense of distance. The steering wheel, what does that mean to you? It's like turn right and then you're off the road. Turn left, you're on the road. Speed up, slow down. What do those things mean to you? But one of the reasons I think that the rumor about Stevie Wonder is true is because when he started getting woke in the 1970s, before his music became completely inane, he made some very good albums in the early 70s, Inner Visions being one of them. But when he adopted this sort of Black Power look with the cornrows and the like, and I thought, this is a blind man. This is very cruel of the people looking after him to make him look like this. And then it occurred to me, no. If it was other people choosing this for him, they wouldn't have dared make him look like that. That this must have been his own personal decision. Anyway, let's go up to the top here. Sorry I didn't get to the chat earlier. It's just, there's just so much news today. You notice this? It's like for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, there's one story. We're all going to die. Maybe we're not all going to die. And how are the celebrities holding up? Well, we went through 2.5 months of that. And now we have some actual news. Le Comte de Brea says investigative journalism is dead in America. Well, with regard to the Daily Mail, to which you're referring, it's not so much a question of investigative journalism as simply reporting the facts that are freely available. William Hicks has a quotation here. I don't know where the quotation is. Is it from Road Warrior? I'll read it then. Their leaders talked and talked and talked, but nothing could stem the avalanche. The world crumbled, cities exploded, a whirlwind of looting, a firestorm of fear. Men began to feed on men. Dawn from Beyond says, Trump slide 2020. I'm sure the Democrats, certainly in their media enablers, believe that the events in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and elsewhere are a boon to the Democratic Party. But of course, they always forget that the flyover people, those dumb guys that Major Tom Nichols is always assailing, their vote is equal, exactly equal to theirs. And so when ordinary Americans see cities going up in flames and the leaders of these cities refusing to do anything about it, whereas the president of the United States says, you stop it or I will, well, I know which side they're on. Lecomte de Boreas has some interesting speculation on this. I looked into the Floyd thing, and it is as I thought. Floyd was a suggestion that he's a certain type of criminal, and Chauvin, the cop, is being investigated for being involved with organized crime gangs. Again, the suggestion that they knew each other for 22 years and worked together in several jobs. I read a report that apparently Chauvin owns 3 houses, and one of them in an expensive part of the city. Okay. Don from Beyond says it had been noted and seen in footage that Chauvin was wearing a badge which looks nothing like the badges of the regular police who are also on the scene raising questions. It's in the Washington Post, among other sources. Glib Medley suggests heart condition, probably drugs in the body. I don't know. I mean, maybe he just completely panicked. You know, that's a very nasty position to be in for almost 90 minutes. And maybe it just, his adrenaline went through the roof. I don't know how many of you have ever, had an adrenaline experience. I was once administered adrenaline before an operation. And this terrifying experience that I'd completely lost control of the physical reality. It was really, really unpleasant. Yeah, okay, I see that, the speculation, we very deep into the speculation as to there must be more to this story. Metal Mike makes a pretty good joke here. What the protesters don't realize is that masks are not all that effective. They need to physically distance from each other. Well, that's over now, isn't it? Glib Medley, happy International Menstrual Day. Wasn't that yesterday? I may talk about that. The mayor of Toronto, just an utterly fatuous man. Neil Terry says, after 3 months of hibernation, American liberals had to pop out like a political groundhog and remind everyone that they are truly just worthless a-holes. John Tory's proclamation, which Metal Mike pointed out to me. There's certain things that I come across and I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay, this is just sickening pause, and I just glance over it. But Metal Mike pointed out there was something very peculiar about this pronouncement. See, the question is, who is able to menstruate? Rather like the question, who is able to give birth to a child? And apparently these are controversial assertions. Now, okay, just a second here. Dawn from Beyond, face masks come in handy when looting stores. No need to worry about security cameras. This has been pointed out in many places in the United States that this is driving store owners crazy. Metal Mike refers to cops and the RCMP killing a Polish guy who was lost at the airport in Vancouver. That is a terrible, terrible story. I've written about it in the past. It's just a complete breakdown of any common sense. This fellow, he was a Polish immigrant, and he was flying to Canada. He'd foolishly decided to give up smoking on that day, but his mother wasn't there to pick him up, and he began to panic because he didn't understand English, and of course no one at the airport understands Polish. He couldn't smoke. Apparently he had to go to the bathroom, and he couldn't find a bathroom, and he just sort of fell apart, and he threw some things around or whatever, became agitated, and the police were called for RCMP. Officers showed up, and they killed him and got away with it. Yeah, they got away with it because the RCMP gets away with everything, particularly in my province of British Columbia, where they're completely out of control. Disciplinary procedures for RCMP: 5-day suspension or termination. Here's 2 documented cases. An RCMP officer on duty in his squad car was found masturbating, 5-day suspension. An RCMP officer on duty was drunk and plowed into the side of a school bus, 5-day suspension. Bob Paxson says it looks as though KMG has found a trendy pod hotel in Vancouver. Actually, I'm in Victoria. I don't know what a pod hotel is. I've heard of a niche hotel. How come KMG doesn't stream with anyone else? Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps when I get a permanent residence, I will get down to this. But everything has been up in the air for like 3 months now, which is about the time that I started doing this. Glib Medley, the mayor would make a good MC for Drag Queen Story Hour. I don't know whether Glib is referring to the mayor of Minneapolis or the mayor of Toronto. The mayor of Toronto is very fond of drag queens and is constantly being, I won't say constantly, but he has been very often photographed with them, having a whale of a time. There's a photograph where one of these drag queens is giving him a lap dance. How about that? DB Cooper says, has anyone tried pointing out the low Black unemployment figures? Well, apparently there's more important things than that. I mean, I know some people were saying that these low Black unemployment figures were going to help Trump. Others cautioned that there's more important issues at stake for Black people, particularly the question of identity. The Lipped One says, has Kevin discovered the fountain of youth? Who is this young man? Well, it's a question of the light. I have 2. There's a whole bunch of different light sources here. There's a light directly above the camera. There's natural light from windows in the back. There's other lights here in the kitchen area. There's also a mirror here reflecting light. So I guess that is responsible for my visage, which is still hideous, but less so than before. I didn't get around to including Don Lemon. Apparently, he stunned Chris Cuomo with one of his catty little breakdowns. But the amusing thing is Chris Cuomo always looks stunned. Again, I'll use the joke from Veep. He's got that surprise masturbator look. And of course, the other half of the time, Chris Cuomo looks as if he's about to burst into tears, much like the mayor of Minneapolis. But this has been going on for so long that you expected politicians to show strength. I mean, John F. Kennedy, he was a wastrel. He was completely irresponsible. He nearly got the world blown up in 1962, but he was well dressed and good looking, and he gave this impression of strength. But now, no, you got the open shirt or the tie pulled down, short sleeves. I'm just one of you. I'm not going to shave, and I feel your pain. Of course, that was Bill Clinton. Let's talk on national TV about whether I wear boxers or briefs, that sort of thing. And I guess the idea is that women are supposed to like this. And I really don't think that they do. It was reported in 2016 that a great number of female journalists were confessing that even though they hated Trump, they were having sexual dreams about him. And that tells you an awful lot about women. So Trump has tweeted about 230, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And he's clearly going to be like a terrier with a bone on this issue. The White House, 2 hours ago, I want to express our nation's deepest condolences and most heartfelt sympathies to the family of George Floyd. This is the smart political thing to do, no question about it, because, a man has died. I talked about his record. I talked about the ridiculous situation he found himself directly before his death. But, a man has died here, and you don't want to be like George W. Bush and revel in the death of another person, as he did with Carla Faye Tucker. When Tucker Carlson interviewed him, I believe it was in 1999, he asked Bush about the case of Carla Faye Tucker, who was on death row, whether he ever spoke to her. And Bush said, well, why would I do that? I mean, what's she going to say? Please don't kill me. And I thought, I understand that some people celebrate at the execution of convicted murderers, but none of these people have ever had to sign a death warrant. And in the United States, before prisoners are executed, the governor actually has to sign a death warrant. One would think that would sober people up. Trump tweeted later today, looting leads to shooting, and that's why a man was shot and killed in Minneapolis on Wednesday night. Or look at what just happened in Louisville with 7 people shot. I don't want this to happen, and that's what the expression put out last night means. It was spoken as a fact, not as a statement. It's very simple. Nobody should have any problem with this other than the haters and those looking to cause trouble on social media. Honor the memory of George Floyd. 8 hours ago, he tweeted, revoke 230, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which protects social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, etc., from violence, support for terrorism, defamation, theft of intellectual property, because they're not publishers. They're just a platform. But they are acting as publishers, and that's why they're in big trouble now. This is from PJ Media. Violent rioters breach Ohio State House, breaking windows and entering building to protest death of George Floyd. Now, what happened here is a situation similar to that of Minneapolis, and authorities wasted no time breaking up the attack on the State House, sending in the SWAT team to disperse the crowd. Officials used a loudspeaker to announce that emergency had been declared and ordered protesters to leave the area. Throughout the night and into the morning, police deployed pepper spray, tear gas, and flashbangs to control the crowd. You note the difference between Columbus and Minneapolis? And one of the reasons for that might be that the mayor of Columbus, his name is Andrew Ginther, he was actually born and raised in Columbus. Columbus is his city. The mayor of Minneapolis is a carpetbagger. He's a effete fellow from Metro DC who was educated to various degrees before he found his way to Minneapolis. And 5 years after arriving in Minneapolis, 4 years, he was on city council. A man like that, what does historic Minneapolis mean to him? Minneapolis began when he showed up. That is clearly his attitude. Let's see. Well, Chicago cops ordered to stop using force to disperse large gatherings. This I'm reading from Drudge. Protests spread across nation. We're going to start coming to suburbs. Will Twitter delete Trump? Would probably be a bad idea. Customs and Border Protection flying Predator drone overhead. Colin Kaepernick defends protesters. Colin Kaepernick is half white and half black. His parents or his mother gave him up for adoption. He was adopted by nice white people. And with the results that you can see, as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, a society on the brink of complete and utter chaos. That sounds exciting. And this is from what? Hang on just a second. End of the American. Oh, this is from Michael Snyder. I'm curious that the Drudge would link to that. That seems like the old Drudge, you know, not the new Drudge, the new woke Drudge. Michael Snyder writes, it's heartbreaking to watch the violence that is taking place on the streets of Minneapolis. I have quite a few relatives that live in the Twin Cities area, and I've been there many times. In the old days, it always felt so peaceful, but not anymore. The tragic death of George Floyd has unleashed a massive wave of anger, and the riots have made headlines all over the globe. Yeah, around 10 o'clock, protesters stormed in the Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd Precinct building and set it on fire. John Carpenter made a movie. Was it called Assault on Precinct 13? Quite exciting. But they fled in this case. Police released a statement saying, in part, in the interest of the safety of our personnel, the Minneapolis Police Department evacuated the 3rd Precinct of its staff. Protesters forcibly entered the building and have ignited several fires. You know, one gets the impression that if the Minneapolis protesters had been persistent, it would be like the last helicopter out of Saigon in 1975, that every police station in the city would have been abandoned. Let's see. Let's see what kind of a wrap up we have from Michael Snyder. There is a reason why so many people are looking to move out of our major cities right now. America is literally in the process of coming apart at the seams, and there will be a lot more rioting, looting, and civil unrest in the days ahead. Well, that depends upon the response. And I want to get to the response, because it's not just black cities. It's not just blacks who riot. Vancouver has had 2 very serious riots, and they were about hockey. Okay? Because when was this? Was this 1995? The Vancouver Canucks lost to the New York Rangers, and there was a very serious riot downtown. Now, in 2011, there was a much more serious riot. I'll read from Wikipedia. The 2011 Vancouver Stanley Cup riot was a public disturbance that occurred in the downtown core of Vancouver, British Columbia, on Wednesday, June 15, 2011. The riot broke out immediately after the conclusion of the Boston Bruins' win over the Vancouver Canucks in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, which won the Stanley Cup for Boston. The Canucks had been up 3-1 in games, and they choked, losing 3 games in a row. I was living right across from baseball stadium, soccer stadium in downtown Victoria at the time. And they did this silly thing where they invite people to come and sit for free in this stadium and watch it on the jumbo screen, which is not all that jumbo. Instead of, say, watching it in the comfort of your apartment or home, in which you can have your beer and your snacks, you know, cheap, right? Much cheaper than in the stadium. Also, the bathroom is like a 5-second walk away. But in Game 7, you know, there was this nervousness because the Canucks had dropped 2 games in a row, and the series was tied 3-3. And there was all this raucous shouting that I could hear from across the street. And they sang the American national anthem and the Canadian national anthem, this screaming and yelling. And this, you know, I could hear the murmur, you know, up to the first 10 minutes of the game. And then I noticed this ominous quiet. And I thought something bad is happening. So, you know, I haven't followed hockey for years, but, you know, I went on the internet and found out that it was pretty clear that Vancouver was going to lose this game and lose the Stanley Cup. And I thought, are the police ready for this? No, they were not. Not even close. What happened, to begin with, was that fans spilled out of the Rogers Arena, which is downtown. It's right downtown. That's where the Canucks play. And, you know, they were drunk and surly, or just drunk and furious, and they started attacking cars, slashing tires of cars, smacking up cars, knocking out headlights and taillights. And this became known, and the police sat on their hands. And it escalated and it escalated. And by 10 or 11 o'clock at night, downtown Vancouver, all of it was in the control of the rioters. And this went on pretty much till the next morning with large-scale damage. And it was pointed out at the time that there's a protocol. 1,204 criminal charges against 352 suspected rioters. Those are the ones that they caught. Okay, here's the protocol. When this kind of disorder breaks out, the police come in and they hit fast and hard. Because if they don't, they're showing weakness. And they're encouraging other people to get away with it. But of course, that seems to be the police protocol in American cities, certainly in Baltimore, Ferguson, Minneapolis, and St. Paul, that you got to give the rioters space. I mean, their cause is justified, so it's just bricks and mortars, right? People's livelihoods aren't important. It's just property. I was talking about the Black unemployment rate. This is, I suppose, in honor or connected to Black History Month. This is a survey from Pew Research Center. Black adults are more likely than other groups to see their race or ethnicity as central to their identity. And the poll measured the percentage in each group who say being whatever race is extremely or very important to how they think about themselves. White people said that being white, 5% of them said it was extremely important to them. 10% said it was very important. Asians, 27% said extremely important. 29% said very important. Hispanic, 31% said extremely important. 28% said very important. Blacks, 52% said extremely important. And 22% said very important. So if you add those two categories, you see the startling difference between white people and black people in the United States, with 74% of blacks saying that being black is either extremely or very important to them, and only 15% of whites saying the same. I mean, this explains so very much. Now, we're supposed to have this rainbow coalition, you know, but that's not how it turned out in Minnesota, because the blacks come first, and there was violence not just against white-owned businesses or white-controlled symbols. Heartbreaking to wake up to the news that McGizzy Communication, a 40-year-old Native youth organization, was burned in the Minneapolis riot. Reports from the org state that everything was lost: archives, historic material, photos. And what else do we have? We have a radio station, La Raza Radio, one of the few Spanish language radio stations in the Twin Cities, was in a building near the 3rd Precinct Police Station. The building burned down to the ground. The station manager has texted me this morning. Total loss, he says. And Second City bureaucrat who disappeared from Twitter and then mysteriously reappeared when in the last couple of days, I suppose nothing to do with Donald Trump. He commented, the media and DNC constantly stoking black ethno-narcissism tends to produce negative externalities like marginalizing other historic victim groups, or in this case, burning down their property and erasing their history. So, the Z-Man comments, the fact is, I don't care all that much. I don't care about these people, as I don't think they should be in the same country as me. We're under 3 generations now of trying to make this work, and we still have blacks rioting in the streets. Many of the rioters in Minneapolis are foreigners. These are non-whites imported to punish the whites living in places that had few non-whites. Instead of sitting around Africa, they were plopped into the Twin Cities by people who hate us. The people responsible for Ilhan Omar are the problem, not the people running wild in the streets. Sure, the rioters are the immediate problem if you live in one of these places, but they are a symptom. The cause is a ruling class that defines itself by its hatred of white people. You can be sure that the usual suspects are laughing themselves silly over what's happening in Minnesota right now. As far as they are concerned, the people of that city are getting what they deserve. Jim Kunstler's column today speaks of an ominous convergence. And so, with the unjust killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the quest for cosmic justice resumes. That is, the justice that settles all the scores of racial grievance for all time, which, of course, is unlikely to be satisfied by any means. And he points out that there is far less ambiguity or no ambiguity, he claims, in this case versus, say, Michael Brown and St. Trayvon Martin. 2 days of protests and nighttime riots have commenced in that city and are now spreading to cities across the country with Memorial Day in the rearview window, you might say, as the old song goes. Summer's here and the time is right for fighting in the streets. It appears that the progressive left is all for letting it rip. Their chief signaling device, the New York Times, ran this headline today: National Guard called as Minneapolis erupts in solidarity for George Floyd. You see, this wasn't a riot. It was an eruption of solidarity. Kunstler comments, this sounds to me a bit like a stamp of approval for a lawlessly violent response to an act of official stupidity. Is the Times in solidarity with the mayhem? Which raises some questions. How much rioting, looting, and arson will be enough to satisfy that sense of solidarity in the quest for justice? 3 nights, 3 weeks, 3 months? Will it cease if and when Officer Chauvin is charged with murder or manslaughter? How much rioting, looting, and arson will the authorities in other cities allow to rip before they move to forcefully stop it? Does all this disorder amplify itself in a feedback loop as it plays out? Those would be tough questions in ordinary times, but we're in an extraordinary convergence of crises that includes an unresolved COVID-19 pandemic, an unprecedented economic collapse, and the furious after effects of a failed political coup that steeped the nation in delusion, institutional breakdown, and factional enmity. Black America is not the only group in the land that has an axe to grind. Those rising share values, which enrich a tiny percentage of the public, are a direct result of the Federal Reserve inflating the national debt by printing money from thin air. It comes in the form of bonds, the interest on which ultimately has to be paid by taxpayers. Many will not fail to notice that it smells like a scam. Will the economically floundering public revolt against it? Will they take to the streets and start burning down things other than police stations and auto zones? Could all that intersect with black street violence in cities across the land? A hint was suggested in cable TV video of rioters on the streets of Minneapolis hoisting a sign that said, "Kill all white people." The progressive left has indulged in excused sentiments like that for years. Remember New York Times editorial board hire Sarah Jong tweeting, "Cancel white people," and quote, "dumbass fucking white people," unquote? What if those maledictions are acted out? Does the left, including the Democratic Party, want to ignite a race war in America on top of a second Great Depression in plague year? Well, as we found out yesterday, the actress Frances Farmer is actively calling for a race war. Once cycles of violence are set in motion, they are very difficult to stop. The animosities between different groups in the USA are not so different in character from what's been seen in other places around the world in recent times. The strife in Northern Ireland, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the civil war in Lebanon, the factional fighting in Libya, Syria, Iraq, all of them grew out of quest for cosmic justice, and all of those conflicts produced lasting damage to the societies they inflamed. Well, curious thing about Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and Lebanon is that you had, let's say, a racial group that apparently was responsible for all of the bad things. That there would be the Orangemen in Northern Ireland, and Christians in Lebanon, and the Serbs in Yugoslavia. They formed militias to protect themselves ferociously, savagely, one might say. There is nothing like this happening in the United States or in any other Western country. Kunstler points out that the New York Times can put on his editorial board someone who's effectively calling for the erasure, extermination of white people, and there is no pushback. Not yet, anyway. There may well be. Whose side are you on? Well, we know whose side Justin Trudeau was going to be on. Many Canadians of diverse backgrounds, are watching, like all Canadians are, the news out of the United States with shock and with horror. Anti-Black racism is real. It's in the United States, but it's also in Canada. Oh dear, I wonder what he intends to do about this. We have work to do as well in Canada and in our systems that we need to work forward on. And I call on all Canadians, whether it's anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or racism and discrimination of any time, to stand together in solidarity. There's that word again. Now, I recall well during the 1960s that Canadians were very, very smug about the events in the United States, first in the Deep South, and then in places like Watts and the northern cities, that, well, this sort of thing doesn't go on in our country. That's because there were no Blacks living in Canada. It's really that simple. As late as 1971, there were 34,400 people, Blacks in Canada. That was the total out of a population of 21 million. There's 1.2 million now, 3% of the population. As a result of a specific change, a deliberate change in policy. And Black Lives Matter is in Toronto. They're very, very angry. And I'll get to that a little later. We may see something. The Chinese apparently are pleased by what is happening in America. This is from the Global Times. It's a beautiful sight. Chinese call Minneapolis a beautiful sight. So this is a semi-official newspaper, and they are reveling. China has not deployed any military force a year after the Hong Kong turmoil, but Trump has threatened to resort to military force just 4 days into the protests. Hong Kong mobs take a better look at the country you are begging for help, one netizen said. Chinese netizens, I haven't heard that word used in many years, compared it with foreign reporters' performance and Hong Kong police's tolerance to them during the Hong Kong unrest, and called on Hong Kong police to tighten law enforcement to foreign reporters. Referring to the protests as a beautiful sight to behold, many netizens showed their support to the protesters. 5 demands from Minnesota. Release U.S. citizens arrested during the protests, establish a supervision team to investigate U.S. police, disband U.S. black cops, abolish U.S. law on national security and the U.S. presidential election system. Read one comment which aped the 5 demands listed by the Hong Kong protesters. Yes, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a movie, I believe it came out in 1966, called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? It was a big hit at the time. It won awards. It's written by Edward Albee, a great American playwright. Edward Albee is very much like Tennessee Williams, that his plays cannot be understood if you look at the male and female couples as actually homosexual couples, 2 men. Because you look at the interaction between men and women in the plays of Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee, and you say, that's not real. That's not even close to being real. Anyway, this movie, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, it's stupid. It's almost unendurable, but it was a big hit at the time. And there's a famous scene in it starring Sandy Dennis as a hysterical blonde woman seeing Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor go at it. She is with George Segal in a restaurant. And I wrote earlier today, watching white progressives cheer on the sack of Minneapolis is like watching Sandy Dennis in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, howling for the blood of others. She's almost in an orgasmic state. She's so excited. And she's screaming, violence, violence. The progressives love violence. The Antifa News Network, aka Vice, has chimed in. Minneapolis bus drivers refuse to transport George Floyd protesters to jail. And Vice comments, this is what solidarity looks like. Well, yeah, maybe closer to, again, the collapse of a society that Michael Snyder was talking about. Some years ago, Taylor Swift was referred to mostly ironically as our girl, and the suggestion that she harbored, right-wing or nationalist views. Well, she was silent on politics until a couple of years ago when she made it clear that she is as woke as everyone else. This is from the Washington Post, which covers all the important stories. Emily Yar writes, this week, celebrities from Cardi B to Kim Kardashian. Yeah, celebrities as valuable as that used their massive social media platforms to condemn the death of George Floyd. After a chaotic night of protests and a tweet from President Trump that Twitter hid for glorifying violence, another celebrity spoke up with a harsh message, and it wasn't who anyone might have expected. Well, Emily Yar clearly hasn't been paying attention. Taylor Swift tweeted, after stoking the fires of white supremacy and racism your entire presidency, you have the nerve to feign moral superiority before threatening violence? When the looting starts, the shooting starts, we will vote you out in November. Retweeted more than 100,000 times in an hour. You know, when I see these people like Taylor Swift going out of the way to be woke and demonstrating whose side they are on in this dispute, I wonder if they realize that a great number of the people who, buy their records, attend their concerts, are actually voted for Trump. Will vote for Trump again this year. There are, of course, you could say that Taylor Swift was bullied into this, but Taylor Swift was so big on the pop scene that she was, I would say, immune to bullying. She started hanging out with Lena Dunham. Like, why would anyone want to do that? Seriously, ever. Why would anyone want to hang out with Lena Dunham? And perhaps in solidarity, that word again, with Lena Dunham, Taylor Swift started packing on the pounds. I mean, seriously. And I got the same problem as Chrissy Teigen. Chrissy Teigen, who's a former model and now a professional housewife, she had breast implants. But then Chrissy Teigen gained a lot of weight, so she started to look ridiculous. Taylor Swift, similarly, was a thin girl, certainly thin on top. She had breast implants. She gained a whole bunch of weight, and it looks ungainly. Chrissy Teigen has announced, and everyone's pretty excited about this, after 2 weeks after saying that she was quitting social media, well, she's back again, telling the whole world that she's going to have her breast implants removed. Because, when I think about sexual excitement, I really like to think about a women's body being sliced open and, bits of plastic being taken out of them. That really gets me going. I don't know. They don't even think about the nature of the attraction to them. I didn't know that Chrissy Teigen had breast implants until she decided to tell the world. But now we all have to think about her being sliced up again. John Boyega, who is an English actor who appeared in Star Wars, in those movies that there was a tremendous backlash against because, racism, that if you don't go out to see the last 3 Star Wars movies and, buy the Blu-rays, buy all the merch, and if you didn't pay to see Cat Lady Ghostbusters, it means you're a racist, also misogynist. So he is very upset, John Boyega, very upset about the death of George Floyd. And this just burns, he tweeted, seems to be a never-ending cycle. The murderers need to be charged severely. Even in the face of death, this man was given zero empathy. Curious word, empathy. And so some people were upset with his foul language. And in some sort of a podcast he was on, Instagram Live, Speaking to the 2,200 people tuned in, that's not very many. He said, quote, "So I'll say it again. Fuck you, racist white people. I said what I said, and if you don't like it, go suck a dick. Seriously. Cool it with the homophobic remarks, John Boyega." I'm just wondering and kind of hoping secretly that there's going to be a tremendous backlash against him for this. I mean, is he suggesting that this loving act of sexuality is somehow disgusting? That is something that you'd wish on your worst enemies? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Of course, this all gets more intersectional by the day. David A. French of National Review, who is the king of the conservatives. He is the fellow who said that Drag Queen Story Hour was a shining example or some such of American liberty. He wrote, "Property crimes are not capital crimes. Good Lord." Quote, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity," which, of course, is a quotation from a poem by William Butler Yeats. I responded, "I know that in any situation you're programmed to use a cliche already flogged harder than a dead horse. But doesn't the conservative style manual call for something from Burke or Tocqueville here?" The white cockade responded to me, "French has to go through his 'don't talk to me about violence, I am an Iraq vet' routine first." Yeah. David A. French was in JAG in Iraq, and he was awarded a Bronze Star, which enraged me when I found out about this. But then I was informed that the Bronze Star is now, it's just a participation medal now, except for ones that have the device, the Valor device, which is actually soldiers who distinguished themselves in combat. Of course, I don't mean to mock David A. French's heroism. I'll tell you, story that once when he was in his office, his JAG office in the green zone, the air conditioning went out and it didn't get fixed for 2 hours. It was worse than Fallujah. Harrowing tale. David Frum, born Canadian, author of The Axis of Evil. How did that work out, by the way, for the United States? With these armed intruders, the president urged the governor of Michigan to make a deal. And there's a picture of the protesters at the Capitol building in Lansing, Michigan. And of course, he's comparing them to the rioters on the streets of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and elsewhere. Well, these fellows who went to the Capitol building to protest the lockdown didn't go on a rampage and burn down Lansing. But I don't know that we can expect David Frum to appreciate the difference. Michael Moore, who has a very interesting film out now about the hoax that is the Green Revolution, his comment on Twitter was, "Good citizens burning down the evil police precinct in Minnesota after all police were out and safe. All police should go home. No violence, please. Police headquarters should be demolished by the city tomorrow as a show of contrition to Black America. Rebuild police department with decent kind of people, aka people of color." I don't know whether Michael Moore knows this. A great many of the officers who are accused and sometimes charged of brutality, even fatal brutality against Black people are Black people themselves. My response to Michael Moore was, "Get off your knees, white man." Khomeini TV commented, "If you're dark-skinned walking in the US, you can't be sure you'll be alive in the next few minutes. Hashtag I can't breathe. Hashtag Black Lives Matter." The president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, tweeted, "The racist and fascist approach that led to the death of George Floyd in the U.S. city of Minneapolis as a result of torture has not only deeply saddened all of us, but it has also become one of the most painful manifestations of an unjust order we stand against across the world. Wow, a real liberal that Erdogan is. Who would have thunk it? Unwoke Duffy, who has a Twitter account that I go to every day, he commented, "Now we just need Kim Jong-un to weigh in." Of course, this happened in the 1960s as well. A lot of the world mocked the United States for the racial problems it was having. The Soviet Union was very good at this. And actually, RT and such outlets keep the tradition up to this day. Of course, there's a question of how much the Soviet Union actually understood about the United States, and the ignorance went both ways. A friend of mine who read the Russian press told me he'd seen an article, I think in Izvestia, about America and how it's supposedly so economically superior, but it was all a fraud. And this reporter said that he'd been in a supermarket and he'd noticed the tremendous variety of dog and cat food. And he'd apparently seriously believed that Americans were so poor, that's what their diet subsisted of. Mike Tyson tweeted May 28th and then deleted, "If white people rioted every time a black man killed them, we'd never have any peace." Some woman with an Irish name in the New Republic, Katie McDonough. The Irish are the worst offenders in this regard. You know, they want to be honorary minorities. Dennis Leary carrying on that the Irish Americans are like the Jews or the blacks. No, they're not. Not even close. I speak, I'm Irish background myself. I mean, you can tell from my name, right? So it begins when property is destroyed by black protesters. It must always be understood in the context of the historical racialization of property. The journalist Raven Rakia wrote in 2013, "When the same system that refuses to protect black children comes out to protect windows, what is valued over black people in America becomes very clear." The racialization of property. How exactly did that happen, by the way? How did property get racialized? Was there just communal property? Did all the black people in America and other people of color, was it sort of a communist system where everybody shared equally? And then the evil white people said, "We're racializing this property. We keep it all. You don't get any." And, the same system that refuses to protect black children, you mean from black men shooting them, either deliberately or accidentally? I don't know who Raven Rakia is, but it's just, they really see the revolution is coming. They really see this. Now, what the place for Katie McDonough would be in this black-led revolution, women like her seem to believe that the new Black Panthers, whoever, are going to, race to her and say, "Thank you for your solidarity. We won't forget you." No. You still hear complaints that there are not enough people of color in American newsrooms. In my country, one might get the impression they've come to dominate the newsrooms. But how about 100% people of color writing for the media and appearing on television? Does that sound so fantastic? When the Washington Times did an expose of the shocking condition of the DC Metro, they found out that 97% of the employees of the DC Metro were black. This is a city where the black population has fallen to close to half of the total, and 97% of the employees of DC Metro were black at that time. So I don't know. It just, they may have the wrong idea about the revolution. I'm going to talk briefly about COVID-19. Yeah, that story. Remember that story? Remember it was the only thing that we talked about? Toby Young has some fun again. Oh, I like the The illustration, it's Steve McQueen on his iconic, I believe, Triumph motorcycle in the 1963 film, The Great Escape. I was reading about The Great Escape a few days ago. There are two great films for children, both directed by John Sturges, The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape. They are thrilling films. I suppose boys would like them more than girls. They're thrilling films, and they are simple stories of good versus evil. Spoiler alert, they both have unhappy endings. I suppose that would not be permitted, but I watched these films many, many times when I was young, and I had the same reaction each time to the unhappy endings. Pretty much everybody dies, right? Which is, I guess, the struggle for good is a difficult one. And that, the struggle for good versus evil is going to create martyrs. And as Unamuno said, Miguel de Unamuno, the Spanish philosopher, faith does not make martyrs, martyrs make faith. Here's another story from Canada. Brian Jones, a columnist for a Canadian newspaper called the St. John's Telegram, has lost his weekly gig after writing a piece in which he pointed out that public sector workers in Canada are having an easier time of it during lockdown than private sector employees. The former have been furloughed on full pay, nice work or non-work, if you can get it, while the latter are expected to subsist on $2,000 a month. Needless to say, this column provoked a storm on Canadian Twitter, with hundreds of outraged readers demanding that Jones be fired for wrongthink. So what did the Telegram's editors do? Tell a hashtag activist to take a running jump? Alas, not. They fired the heretical columnist, and here's how they announced the decision on Twitter. Naturally, quote, "Dear readers, as a daily news publication, we aim to offer you an informative mix of features, news, fun diversions, and diverse opinions." Yeah, diversity. With opinions in particular, sometimes we push the edges. Ooh, so edgy. And explore unpopular opinions. You're protesting too much here. When we go too far, you tell us. We're always grateful for that. This week, you stepped up once again with scores of readers responding to Brian Jones's May 20th column. Your feedback was an important gauge for us and for him, and in response, he has decided that this week's column will be his last. As excuses go, that's right up with being told your opinions violate our community guidelines. We find out that the president of Tanzania, John Pombe Magufuli, is a skeptic. He's a COVID-19 skeptic. And, in Wales, the First Minister is granting people permission to leave their homes. And in Russia, the doctor and television presenter Alexander Myasnikov has been given the task of informing the Russian people about coronavirus treatment and prevention methods and to battle fake news about COVID-19. He recently called the country's reported low death rate a Russian miracle, but in a moment of candor, when he thought he was off the air, he blurted out the truth, according to the Washington Times. In an interview that aired Wednesday, Myasnikov gestured for the cameras to stop running and said candidly, "It's all bullshit. It's all exaggerated. It's an acute respiratory disease with minimal mortality," he told television personality Ksenia Sobchak in an interview for her YouTube project, "Why Has the Whole World Been Destroyed? That I don't know," Myasnikov said. So we'll see if there's anything from Alex Berenson here. One of the heroes of this sad event. Xenia Jardin, who was in the news recently for something. She's some internet personality of the 1990s. A gentle reminder that provoking racial conflict between Americans to weaken the U.S. is a tactical goal the Russian military assault on our 2016 elections sought to achieve. And Luke O'Neill commented, "I take it back, Berenson was right about weed." Alex Berenson wrote a book, which will be coming up on the book club, in which he makes the case against marijuana, particularly for young people. Claiming that it is highly correlated to mental illness. And he repeats a bunch of threats, death threats that he has gotten, that people have made publicly because of his views on COVID-19. Yes. Add Baton Rouge to the cities reporting a massive spike in overdose deaths this year. Remember, all by themselves, overdoses could account for a significant chunk in the rise of all-cause mortality. Sometime next year, we're going to get a death toll for the year, and we're going to get the number of so-called excess deaths will be calculated. This is just a calculation, mind you, and the causes of these excess deaths will be calculated. There's no way of knowing for sure. And you could expect to see ferocious battles over this, because the powers that be are going to have to justify their lockdowns, which, one more reminder, destroyed the economy, destroyed society, and eliminated civil liberties. In Canada, the latest information, 6,918 deaths, just under 89,000 cases. Saskatchewan has zoomed ahead of Manitoba. Saskatchewan now has 10 deaths. Well, as Manitoba is stuck at 7. I will point out that Saskatchewan has 1.1 million people, and the province of Manitoba, I believe, has 1.2 million people. In my own province of British Columbia, there are roughly 2,500 cases. Oh, no new deaths reported, and just 4 new COVID-19. So if we look at the number of deaths in British Columbia, which has a population of 5.1 million people, which is roughly 1/4 of the population of New York State, we have 164 deaths, and they have deaths in the thousands, many thousands. 164 deaths, and on Vancouver Island, I believe Vancouver Island, where I live, I believe the number of deaths is 3. But of course, the whole place was shut down as the result of a condition which could hardly be said to be a crisis, let alone a catastrophe. Experts searching for Asian giant hornet's nests after insect found in BC. Wow, that is quite a stinger on this creature. I'm really not looking forward to that. Trump taking action to eliminate special treatment for Hong Kong. Trump says the U.S. will cut ties with the World Health Organization. That is excellent news. Michael Flynn transcripts released calls with Russian diplomat detail. Of course, the authorities did not want these transcripts revealed. And the question that's been asked about Michael Flynn is, particularly after Judge Emmett Sullivan, who, despite his surname, is not an Irishman, the extraordinary measures that he took to keep prosecuting General Flynn, even though he's a judge and not a prosecutor. People are asking, what does Michael Flynn know? What is buried in this case that could hurt so many people? Well, it remains a mystery for now. Oh, critics describe Premier Kenney's COVID-19 speech as Trumpian. Whoa, Trumpian? That's like the worst insult that you could have in Canada. Now, this is from a CBC story. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, and my old friend made an extraordinary speech in which he said that COVID-19 is a danger to old people, particularly very old people. It is of little danger to anyone else. And he could no longer justify shutting down the province, shutting down the economy on this basis. And as far as I know, and he said that for most people, or for people under the age of 60 or 70, the infection fatality rate was 0.006%. There is no other leading elected official in North America that I know of who has been so bold as Jason Kenney. So, of course, there was a rush to find people to object to what Kenny had said. And of course, they managed to, find them. And one of the fellows that they quoted, from the University of Alberta, that he has a book on this very subject. And hang on, just let me go to his webpage here. His name is Timothy Caulfield. He looks like a real hipster. He is the author of a book called Relax, Damn It, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety, published by Penguin Books. It's a rather unfortunate title, given what's happened today. Oh, and Caulfield was particularly put out because Jason Kenney referred to COVID-19 as a kind of influenza. But I suggested to Professor Caulfield, I look forward to the second edition of your book, retitled Panic, Damn It, A User's Guide to the Public Health Dictatorship. As previously mentioned, things in Toronto might kick off tomorrow. We have two recent events, one of which a rising young rapper called Houdini, not like that old rap group with the W, but Houdini, like Harry Houdini, was shot to death in a deliberate hit, the kind of deliberate hit which is so closely associated with the rap community. And the Toronto Sun, that its front page headline was "Who Made Houdini Vanish?" which was a hate crime. Apparently, that was incident one. Incident two is an unfortunate young woman, 29 or 30 years old, called Regis Korchinski Packet, or Paquet, don't know how it's pronounced. Her mother called 911 because this young woman who has suffered from epilepsy and severe mental health problems for some years. Apparently there's a dispute between mother and daughter. The police were called, and the young woman ended up falling from a balcony very high up, 30 stories, something like that. Immediately, the charge was made that Toronto Police Service officers threw her to her death. And there is going to be a rally in Toronto tomorrow. Black Lives Matters is a presence in Toronto, although not so much over the last few years. The rumor is that after the 2016 election, George Soros decided that backing Black Lives Matter was a bad bet. And you may have seen in America, you don't hear very much about Black Lives Matters anymore, do you? But in Toronto, Black Lives Matters was blackmailing the Pride Parade. The Pride Parade in Toronto is the biggest of its kind in North America and quite likely the world. They've had major controversies there about gay organizations for or against Israel and whether they should be allowed to march, the intersectionality. But Black Lives Matters demanded that they effectively be given control of the Pride Parade and to make the travails of black gays and the rest of the alphabet put up front, that they were going to lay down the agenda. And the organizers of the Pride Parade said no, but they showed up anyway and attempted to hijack the parade, and they were holding signs such as "Black People Built Toronto." They get this from the United States. There were black workers in the White House, but this meme from several years that black people built the United States, which of course is mostly very untrue. But there weren't any black people in Toronto. And slavery was abolished in the British Empire in, I believe, 1833. Of course, Canada did not become a dominion until 1867. But yeah, if you look at the Toronto media, there are a very large number of angry black people who regularly make the demand, quite seriously, that the police department, Toronto Police Service, should be disbanded because black people don't like it. Oh, Jagmeet Singh, that's actually his name. I'm not making this up. He's the leader of the New Democratic Party. He is a Sikh. And there are, 7 signs of the Sikh, and one of them is the turban, and one of them is the uncut hair, one of them is the beard, another one is the 7 Ks, one of them is a kirpan, which is a dagger, which all Sikhs must carry. He always has this grin on his face, and with the turban and the beard, and I don't know, his eyes, it makes him look like a cartoon villain. He is obsessed with Khalistan, which is what the radical Sikhs call the Sikh homeland in India. He had a resolution proposed and perhaps passed in the Ontario legislature finding the country of India guilty of genocide vis-a-vis the Sikhs. He only became the leader of the New Democratic Party because people in the party, and I suppose in the media, decided, wouldn't it be exciting to have a person of color, to have a Sikh as leader of a major Canadian political party? Well, he led the NDP party to disaster in the last election, where the number of seats was cut in half. But since Trudeau only got a minority government, this was portrayed as a victory for the NDP. So he tweeted today, "Many of us are feeling a lot of pain right now. Anti-Black and Indigenous racism aren't a coincidence." I don't know what that's supposed to mean. "There are decades of policies that have systematically undervalued human life by design: colonialism, underfunding, social exclusion, poverty." Jagmeet Singh's parents decided to come to Canada in the 1970s. There was no slavery in Canada. The Black population of Canada chose to come here willingly, or their parents chose to come here willingly, mostly from Jamaica, but also from Haiti, Guyana. Now, increasingly, we're getting people from Africa. They were not compelled to come here. And again, one must ask the question, if they hate it here so much, why did they come? Why don't they leave? Did they not know that Canada is a white country? Colonialism is hilarious coming from people like Jagmeet Singh, because as I've mentioned before, Sikhs control the leadership decisions of all the parties in Canada, federal and provincial, because they block vote. And there's all sorts of shenanigans that go on. A large number of people are signed up for the leadership elections, and it turns out that a great many of them are members of other parties as well, which it should invalidate their votes, that they actually live in India and not Canada, or that they are dead. But for Sikhs to talk of colonialism, the British Empire used the Sikhs as the shock troops of colonialism, with the result that throughout Asia and Oceania, the Sikhs are not very well regarded, to put it mildly. Yeah, I'm going to get to this story. I'm going to talk about this on Monday. Perhaps there'll be less news. A feud in Wolf Kink erotica raises a deep legal question. I joked a year or so ago or whatever that I'd been looking at a lot of self-published literature by women, and it would seem that the quintessential title of that sort is Raped by My Billionaire Werewolf Stepbrother. And you may think that I'm exaggerating, but I'm not, and we'll talk about that on Monday. This is from the Mirror. New show, Labor of Love, sees 15 men compete to impregnate 41-year-old woman, and just fighting the urge to scream, "Nuke this gay earth." Sex and the City's Kristen Davis, well, life has really turned out well for her, hasn't it? Returns to the small screen to front a controversial reality series that will see 15 men competing to impregnate a 40-year-old woman. Are they really that hard up for sex? It's not a very attractive woman. She's 41 years old. By the time a woman is 41 years old, something like about 90% of her eggs are defective. Kristen Davis, she's been worked on. This, I could barely recognize her in the poster for the show. I'm looking at the men who are competing. They're not old, strangely enough. I guess they just want to humiliate themselves on reality TV. But my last thought on this is we are so close now to a show within a show which was featured on 30 Rock called MILF Island. Any of you remember that? 25 super hot moms, 50 eighth grade boys, no rules. And when one of the contestants was dismissed, the host would say something like, Heidi, we no longer want to hit that. Get off MILF Island. Anyway, so I'm going to take a look at the chat. Sex and the City, a show written by gay men. Yes, absolutely correct. Broadcast television has been dominated by homosexuals for several decades now. It's not a... when that Hollywood super agent, Michael, and I can't remember his name, Michael Ovid, he talked about this and he was run out of Hollywood. He was seriously run out of Hollywood for this. This was 2 decades ago. Chogokin666 says Sikhs are Indian Cossacks. Well, Sikhism developed in the Middle Ages as a militant Hindu response to the Mughal or Muslim invasion of India. What these people are doing in British Columbia or California or Fiji or whatever is a very interesting question. Why they are allies with, I don't know, this rainbow coalition. Of course, one of my sisters once worked at the multicultural radio station in the Fraser Valley, and they had made the mistake on Sunday evenings of putting the Hindu show next to the Sikh show. I mean, one followed the other, and there were regular brawls. In the parking lot, of course, the greatest terrorist incident in Canadian history is the bombing of an Air India flight by Sikh militants. The bombs were placed in Vancouver International Airport, and many of the militants involved remain heroes to the Sikh community in British Columbia, and there are large pictures of them when the Sikhs have their celebrations. Fog on the Tyne. That was a hit version of this in the early 1970s in Britain by a band, Lindisfarne, that was briefly, like for about a year or two, the biggest band in Britain. They're not very well remembered now. Walrus Libertarian says Canada was English and French and very conscious of it. Of course, Canada is made up of people from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, predominantly it was, and the French Canadians have their own province. When I was young, I mean, there was very much a Canadian identity. There's no question about that, but the Canadian identity has now vanished. Was Canada founded as an ethno-state? That's a difficult question. It was founded as a British colony. There's no question about that, and it was a British colony. I mean, John Grace, the founder of my clan in Canada, came here in 1840. He was not an immigrant. He was a colonial, a British Empire settler. And that's how Canada was understood until fairly recently in Canada. Jagmeet Singh took over the traditionally white working class party, right? Well, the NDP used to represent the working class. It has not represented the working class for decades. You know, my old joke is working class party, more like faculty club party. Because the Liberals have been, battling the NDP over this, but the NDP it's all about identity politics now, and they're trying to out identity politics the Liberals, which is it's a losing battle, particularly when you have someone like Jagmeet Singh as your leader, because as the proportion of minorities in this country increases and they become more concentrated in certain cities, such as Vancouver and Toronto, they can run their own candidates, but this leads to bitter battles between a Sikh candidate versus a Chinese candidate. You see that in Vancouver, just these ferociously bitter battles because the Sikhs and the Chinese do not like each other. And the old way it was played is the Liberals or the NDP would run some white stooge who could appeal to all the different minorities. When you run a specific minority, the other minorities get nervous. I remember when British Columbia got a Sikh premier after Glenn Clark was forced out. This fellow, he doesn't observe the 7Ks. And I was watching the NDP convention on TV. It was in the Pacific Coliseum, which is where the Vancouver Canucks used to play. It holds about 15,000 people. And I was scanning the crowd, and I noticed something unusual. There were no Chinese faces that I could see. Are Sikhs exclusively Punjabi? Yes, they are. The Sikhs are to the Punjab as the Jews are to Israel. They have a great deal in common in many different ways, actually. So anyway, I'm going to wrap the show up. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you would click on the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you don't already. If you'd like to support the show and support it this time, would be very much appreciated. My PayPal account is Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. I will leave you with my now traditional farewell and benediction, which is in these times of total social isolation and also the world going up in flames, or at least America going up in flames. I do dearly wish that all of you find some genuine human companionship. Thank you and good night.